Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at this tank. This is the BT-7, part of the BT series, BT-2, BT-5, and it was designed based on something from Christie, an American. It was a convertible light cavalry tank, and it is kind of the direct reason for the tank today. One of the most famous tanks, perhaps the most famous tank in human history, at least to this point, and probably forever, considering how tanks have been going. Of course, we're talking about the T-34, and the two are very closely connected. In 1937, Stalin's government wanted a replacement for the BT-7 series, and as a result, a team was set up, and a gentleman, an engineer by the name of Mikhail Koshkin, was assigned to lead it and develop this light tank. And he did just that. The first prototype, known as A-20, was created, and it was quite similar to the BT-7. It had sloped armor, but it was pretty much all around now, and it had a 45mm gun, and it used the Christie convertible suspension system. So at first it was a nominal improvement over the BT-7, but Koshkin successfully, because he lived, almost demanded Stalin to let him create a larger version, what he called a universal tank, not only to replace the BT-7, but also to replace the T-28 and others. So this went ahead and became the A-32 prototype, and it had a 76.2mm gun, and while it used the Christie suspension system, it did away with the convertible track chain tire road system because it wasn't really useful. And it had a few other product improvements and whatnot. And the two were pitted against each other at Cuba in 1939, the A-20 and the A-32. And wouldn't you know it, even though the A-32 had more armor, a heavier gun, it really wasn't any less maneuverable. It only lost a little bit in speed, and it was a much more capable tank. So Koshkin was correct. It was the way to go. Although some in the military were resistant, as usually happens in the Russian Red Army. Two groups, one of them wanted to kind of keep on business as usual, making T-26s, BT-7s, hell, maybe even T-28s because insanity. I don't think anyone was crazy enough to still want to keep making T-35s at least. And others wanted to progress with the new A-32. Well, in early January of 1940, the first two A-32 prototypes were constructed, and these would lead to what was known as the A-34, and this would be a further improved version with thicker armor, some other up changes, what have you. There would also be that very famous road test in April and May of 1940, where a prototype would be driven from the factory to Moscow, and then to the Finnish border, down to Kiev, visit Minsk, and go back. And while they found some problems with the drivetrain and what have you, they fixed it, and that really did shake down the bugs. And as a result, the A-34 was put into mass production, becoming the T-34, with the first production models, sometimes known as the T-34 Model 1940, coming out of the factory in September of that year. Unfortunately, Koshkin himself had caught pneumonia and fought with it over the summer, but finally died in September, right after his tank just started to go into production. And so while the tank lived, the designer unfortunately did not. And before I progress, like most of my models here, this is a 172 scale diecast. This one's actually not from Eagle Moss. You can buy it because it's on the stand. You can unbolt it. Has a moving turret, and this one does have a moving gun. And it's just one of the little tanks. So these were just coming in to production by the end of 1940. The initial T-34, often called T-34-76 after its gun, also known as the Model 1940, was about 26.5 tons and about 6.8 meters long. Had a crew of 4, driver, commander, who doubled as the gunner, and we had the loader and machine gun operator. It was armed with the 76.2 millimeter gun. It also had a 7.62 DT machine gun in the hull, and another located coaxially in the turret, so a total of 2. It was, of course, diesel powered, because why not? And much like the original A-32 and A-34 prototypes, it was not convertible, but it did feature sloped armor, most often at about 60 degrees. And it did have a lot going for it. It was actually quite a nice modern tank, but it was also quite affordable to produce. Now, the original 1940 had the L11 76 millimeter gun, which in practice it didn't work out so great. So in 1941, we had the Model 1941, which introduced a little bit heavier armor in a few locations, and more importantly, an updated 76 millimeter cannon known as the F-34. It performed much better, although it was not actually a change authorized by the government, as is famously known. They also went to an improved radio set, but still not all tanks had one. In fact, many did not. And if you notice by the antenna here, the radio set's actually located in the hull, not in the turret. Speaking of the turret, it is a 2-man turret. We have the loader and the commander, who doubles as the gunner, and they are quite chummy in here. This is not a very big turret, and the sloped armor, the sloped walls, make it even more cramped. So by 1941, these are starting to replace older tanks, namely the T-26 and the BT-7, and this is classified as a medium tank. For the Russia's new heavy tank, we have the KV-1. It's worth pointing out the design team of the KV-1 actually did their best to railroad the T-34 program because, again, Soviet politics. Luckily, they did not succeed. Unless you're Germany, then that would have been great for them. So when Operation Barbarossa kicked off, Russia had only about 960 of these available, and of those, many did not have fully trained crews or were not in serviceable working condition. Some of them were still sitting at the factory awaiting final testing and trials. And if that sounds bad, there were even fewer KV-1s available, only a little over 500. So yeah, the bulk of the fighting still had to be carried out by old 1930s era tanks. And Russia lost a lot of tanks in 1941, over 20,000. And of those, about 2,300 were T-34s. Now some would be knocked out, sent back to a factory, refurbished, and yeah, go back into battle. And after Koshkin's death, the designer and maintainer of the drivetrain system for the design would be promoted, Alexander Moroshkov, and he would continue on and actually help with the evacuation of the factories that famously happened after the German invasion, where they moved them over to the Ural Mountains. A very impressive feat by anyone's standards. So for a time, the prime factory was actually offline in Leningrad while it was being moved out of the way of the Nazis. And so actually the factory in Stalingrad took up the slack in late 1941, early 1942, till the point where they themselves fell under direct threat from the Nazis, and things just became more and more desperate. Early on, the tank was actually mixed results. Today it's a legendary tank, but we're thinking of the later versions, namely the T-34-85. But early on, well, some good things. It proved that it was actually quite good in snow and mud because of nice wide tracks and whatnot. And the sloped armor actually proved to be quite successful at repulsing German 37mm, which was their primary anti-tank round, and 50mm guns. And, well, it was quite affordable to mass produce. That's good. But as is famously known, it had a terribly unreliable, terribly crappy transmission. Something that also plagued earlier Russian tanks like the T-35. So that was a problem. In fact, nearly half of the tanks lost in 1941 were actually lost to mechanical failure rather than direct enemy action. Many were actually captured by the Germans and put back into service after refurbishment and kind of updating to their standards on their end. Another thing, not a lot of tanks had radios. Some did, more than maybe is known, but yeah, communication was kind of a lot of them used signals, flags, what have you. Even the ones that had radios, they still all suffered from kind of poor communication, poor coordination. And part of that was no one's fault because the commander up here also was acting as the gunner, spotter. He had a lot to do, so oftentimes he just didn't have time to really communicate well. On top of that, he often didn't see enemy tanks until they already started shooting at him. Sometimes even not till after they started shooting at him. Russia lost a lot of its trained soldiers in 1941, meaning a lot of the, honestly, kids manning these were raw recruits with only a few days of classroom training on how to even operate a T-34. Keep in mind that Stalin's purges, back in late 1930s, which had already affected the effectiveness of the Red Army in the Winter War, still had major impacts. Now, some had been called back from the Gulag, but many were just shot. So, yeah, they were just without good leadership and good guidance and good tactics. These tanks tended to go out on their own and get themselves killed, or kind of group together, making themselves an easy target and all targeting one or two German tanks, leaving the other ones alone. It was a mess. So between the mechanical issues and just the poor training of the crews and just the newness of the equipment, where the bugs had far from been worked out, keep in mind it was in production for less than a year at this point. Yeah, there's a long way to go before this would become an effective tank. But 1942 would be the make-or-break year for the T-34 and for the Soviet Union, really, because Germany was bringing 75mm high-velocity guns into use, as well as 88mm. They were also up-armoring their panzers, namely the Panzer IV. And they were introducing the new Tiger heavy tank. And it wouldn't be long before the more effective Panther, at least cost-effective Panther, would come into use, although that wouldn't be until 1943. But Germany really was trying, and they had studied the T-34 and really kind of honed in on its weaknesses. And at this point, German commanders, German tankers, had a lot of experience and were very professional, and their tanks were of very high quality. So what was Russia to do? They had lost over 20,000 tanks in 1941, and for every half dozen tanks of theirs they lost, they only knocked out 1 or 2 German tanks. Things were not going well. We've been looking at this T-34-76 for a while. Let's change over to this one. Pretty much the same, just a different paint job. I forget which brand is which. They're pretty well the same. One of these is actually from Curse, which is neat. So yeah, 1941, it did not go well. And, a lot of it had to do with Stalin. It was his fault. But Russia did what it always does. It used its land and its people and its stoicism to continue. The factories were relocated, and it must be said that Morozov would be right there. He was helping move the factories, get the personnel, get the know-how going. He was not a ivory tower person. He was there on the ground. And essentially they would recombine into a new tank factory known as Tankograd, Tank City, which would come online in late 1942. Like I said, until then, a factory in Stalingrad would kind of hold the line, producing nearly half of T-34s. And it was actually there that many of the innovations would happen that would speed up production and lower cost. And it's pretty famously known that the powers that be wouldn't allow any improvements to the tank unless they had to do with speeding up the production and what have you. This was actually the right decision at the time because they really got the cost down from nearly 270,000 rubles per tank, soon down to under 200,000 rubles per tank, and then finally by 1943, just to 135,000 rubles per tank. So basically half. And they did introduce some improvements. For example, they improved the armor, and they simplified the gun. It went from nearly having 900 components, parts, to just over 600. They started using more automated welding and new hardening techniques for the armor plates. And they started using more cast parts. That's right, people. You can not only cast AK parts, you can cast tank parts. And just lots of little simplifications. Like they took all the rubber out because there was a rubber shortage. So if there's a shortage, we simply just don't need rubber. So it was all steel, wheels, tracks, all that stuff. And they would make a few noteworthy improvements. For example, they would improve the transmission and the clutch because they really had to. The transmission problems had to be addressed. It would also give the engine a better air filtration system. And probably most importantly, they would go to a new turret. This would be a cast turret with only a little bit of welding required to assemble it, sometimes called the hexagonal turret. So it was actually cheaper and faster to produce, but it was actually a better turret. It had a little bit more elbow room for the commander and the loader. Not a whole lot more, but a little bit. And eventually the new turret would have 2 hatches, one for each crew, instead of just a single hatch. And eventually it would even give a cupola for the commander, although this would be pretty late. Now, in Western sources, the kind of cheapened version is often known as the Model 1942, with the new cast hexagonal turret known as the Model 1943. But in Soviet sources, they call all the tanks with the original small turret and 76 millimeter gun as the Model 1941, and they don't start calling them 1942s until they go to the new hexagonal turret. And that's because these were made in several factories with hundreds of subcontractors, and many tanks were sent back and rebuilt and reworked and patched up. The point is, there really wasn't a standard. So trying to divide these by all the features is almost a thankless task. The Germans tried, and they drove themselves even crazier than they already were. I should point out that the Germans captured quite a few T-34s and studied them. And they found that it was actually a good design. However, the quality of Russian craftsmanship, welding and what have you, was subpar to say the least. They also found that Russian metallurgy was inconsistent. The mixture of the steel was just, and also the thickness of the armor could vary quite wildly from place to place on the tank. And in 1942, a couple of T-34s were given to America for testing, and at Aberdeen, they pretty much came to the same conclusion. Good design, but it's almost as if it was built by a people fearing for their very lives, being invaded by fascist, totalitarian, rampaging, homicidal maniacs. Funny how that'll do that to you. So, yeah. But by 1942, they were really cranking these out, hundreds per month. And the T-34, the first time it really made a huge impact, aside from just stalling actions, was during Germany's summer offensive in 1942. They really helped stop them in their tracks. And this was absolutely critical in the defense of Stalingrad that year, and directly led to the surrender of the 6th German Army in February of 1943. In 1943 was still very desperate times in the Soviet Union, but things were starting to get a little bit better. By April or May of that year, they were cranking out 1,200 to 1,300 of these per month, which is the equivalent of 2, even 3 complete German divisions. So unless Germany was destroying several divisions a month, they were producing more T-34s than Germany could destroy. So even though the ratio wasn't in Russia's favor, the production was. And this is really where it starts to tell. Yeah, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV were excellent tanks. And the Tiger on its own was good, but of course it was so resource intensive to produce. Even the somewhat cheaper Panther, which would not debut to that July, cost a lot more than a T-34 to make in terms of money and hours. And time is money. And really, the beginning of the end, as you know, what happened that July, when Germany would launch its last major offensive, known as Operation Citadel, which would lead to the extended Battle of Kursk, well, I should say around Kursk, with the largest engagement starting on July 12. 2 million men with 6,000 armored vehicles, plus nearly 4,000 aircraft. It was huge. And Russia would be victorious, but it would come at a cost. They had quite a few T-34s, and a lot of the problems with the engines, transmissions, even visibility and whatnot for the commander. They were getting more and more radios in these things, better training. Things were improving. However, this is when the Panther came, like I said. By this point, the older Panzers had been up-armored. This is really what drove home the fact that the good old 76.2 millimeter cannon, which had been perfectly adequate a couple of years earlier, was just simply not effective. it had to get in pretty close to punch through the Panzer IV's armor, and basically it could shoot all day long at a Tiger and not do any real damage. I mean, I guess eventually, like a couple of days later, 3 days later, type thing. But yeah, this is when they knew they really had to upgun this tank. And at first, what they actually wanted to do was just introduce a whole new design. And this is not a T-34. This is the Su-85 or Su-85. This is a tank destroyer. It has a tank, a self-propelled gun. And I'll do a video looking at this and other self-propelled guns later. This is important because it is built on a T-34 chassis, which you can probably tell. And this is actually where the 85 gun, at least in tank-esque form, first appears. Although this doesn't have a turret, of course. Although it does have a cupola, which is important. So yeah, in 1942, not only did Germany give more armor to their panzers, they upgraded to a 75mm high-velocity gun, which could reliably punch through the T-34's armor. And after testing on a captured Tiger, Russia determined, yeah, we can't punch through this. So that's not a good combo when the enemy can punch through your armor reliably and you cannot punch through theirs, at least not on their heaviest tank. So it was clear something was needed. And this first something was the T-43. This was a new design. It had a new 3-man turret, commander, gunner, loader. It had a heavier armor hull. And it had a new heavier gun, although it still used 70% of the same parts as the T-34. Unfortunately, testing revealed that it still couldn't stand up toe-to-toe with the heaviest German tanks, which was a bit of a problem because they weren't just hoping the T-43 would replace the T-34, but also the KV-1, other heavy tanks. And in testing, it wasn't that much better, and it was not quite as maneuverable as the T-34, and it was going to require expense and time. Now, some in the Red Army wanted to proceed with the T-43, while others wanted no change at all. Let's just keep on making the T-34 with the 76mm gun. Realities be damned. And so, well, this is kind of where the compromise started. The Su-85 has an 85mm tank gun, or mobile gun, which was actually a change, a modification of a anti-aircraft gun. And these were put into production in early to mid-1943 and first saw combat in August of 1943. So it was kind of a proof of the overall concept of mounting this kind of a gun to a T-34 chassis. Therefore, we ended up with the T-34 85, actually model of 1944, because there would be submodels here too. This had the 85mm gun, you can tell by the longer barrel, which was plenty potent to punch through the Panzer IV's armor. It could go up against the Panther, but kind of more even-steven. And it could punch through a Tiger, but it would have to either be onto the side or close range into the front. But, you know, for everything else, yeah. This was the compromise. Taking the T-34, but giving it enough changes to keeping it modern. They would make several minor improvements, including heavier armor, but the big deal besides the gun itself is the new turret. They increased the turret ring by about half a foot to allow for the new 3-man turret. This was actually taken from the T-43. They plunked it right on. and it now has a cupola for the commander, and now he's no longer having to do double, even triple duty, and a radio is standard. Very soon they would move the radio up into the turret too, so it'd be right by the commander. Probably a good place to have it. And they would maintain the two DT 7.62 machine guns. Now the new shells, of course, were larger, heavier. The original T-34s with the little turret could hold about 90 shells. With the larger hexagonal turret, could hold about 100. But with the new version here, we're down to 55 to 60 shells. But they are more effective, so, take it for what you will. And we are a little heavier at about 31 tons, but thanks to other improvements in the engine, its top speed really is about the same at about 32, 33 miles per hour, at least under most conditions. But we have better visibility for the commander. The only downside to this new turret, it is larger, therefore a bigger target. But luckily they did give it thicker armor up to 90 millimeters. So while it is a bigger target, it's also harder to knock out. So they would develop these in late 1943. And the first ones would come out of factory number 112 in January of 1944. And they were more expensive to produce than the T-34. They were about 165,000 rubles when first introduced, again compared with 135,000 for the wartime T-34 76s. Although by 1945 they were able to get this cost down to about 145,000 rubles. So still a little more, but it was a lot more tank for your ruble. So it was, generally speaking, worth it. More importantly for Russia, they were able to produce these at nearly as high of a number as the 76, at about 1,100 to 1,200 per month by the spring of 1944. So very few detractions, a lot of benefits. That's why the 76 would go out of production in 1944 with over 35,000 built. And yeah, of course, in June of 1944, D-Day would occur, and the Germans were definitely on the defensive. And Russia was really improving by this point. Unlike the beginning of the war, now Russia has a lot of veteran tankers, and they've learned to communicate, they've learned tactics, they've learned the weaknesses of the German system, and conversely, Germany's lost a lot of its best tankers and has a lot of poorly trained recruits. And while they still have very nice quality tanks, they never really have the quality slip probably as much as they should. They're not able to make them in near the numbers needed to fight not only the Russians with their T-34, but the Americans with their M4s, plus British tanks and even some French tanks by this point. So they're kind of screwed, and the T-34 had a lot to do with it. It's a very well designed tank. The armor consistency is a lot better. But much like the American M4 Sherman, this was designed for mass production, so it was not as, on a machine-by-machine basis, it's still not as impressive, either in terms of specs or fit and finish, as a Tiger or Panther. But it didn't need to be, Quantity has a quality all its own. And this little model here, this is from Eagle Moss, if you couldn't tell. Nice little model for what they are. Nothing special, but you get rubber tracks and you get a moving turret. Oh, this one's a little stiff. Stiff is good. With that, though, let's end with my probably nicest T-34 model and talk a little bit about post-war history of this very iconic tank. Yeah, this is a perfectly nice little model, especially for the money. But this one is actually quite interesting. This is from Forces of Valor. Most of their tanks are in 132 or 148. This one is still 172. And this is quite a late model, T-34-85. What's neat about this model, it's pretty much all metal. Has a fully moving gun, which is metal. It actually has rolling wheels and tracks. Has the commander sticking out. This seems to be a command vehicle because it has the 2 antennae. And it actually came with, you've got your commander there, and it has 7 other people on foot because a tank without infantry support is very vulnerable. So yeah, it has its own infantry support. It's kind of a little, not exactly diorama, but like that. Has the auxiliary fuel tanks here. And like the later models, it has the smoke canisters in the back. Yeah, it's just a neat little late 85. So they would produce these and, of course, use these in 1944 and in the 1945 in Berlin very successfully. And by May of 1945, Russia had already cranked out over 22,000 during the war, and production would continue through 1946, maybe even into 47. It's a little foggy. They would even introduce the final version, the Model 1946, with an improved engine and improved tracks and wheels, just, working out a few bugs now that it's peacetime. And in 1951, licensed production would start up in both Czechoslovakia and Poland, bringing the total of T-34 85s to just shy of 49,000. So 35,000 of the 76 millimeter version and 49,000 of the 85 millimeter gun version, meaning 84,000 of these tanks were built. Now, to be fair, nearly 45,000 were lost during World War II. A great number of these lost in the early days, being the 3476. But, yeah, that still left well over 40,000 in the world. And Russia would eventually retire this. Actually, it would lead to the T-44, which would quickly lead to the T-54 and the T-64. But that's a story for a whole different video. And they would start giving them to Warsaw Pact members and Combloc allies. For example, in 1949, Russia started giving large numbers of T-34s to China. And believe it or not, China didn't actually make these, although they did set up a factory to refurbish and repair them, and they made individual components. They just never made whole new T-34s, probably because they didn't need to. They very soon would replace it in their frontline service by the T-54 and their own Type 59 tank. And it would be first Russian-supplied tanks to North Korea. Later, Chinese tanks would come over the border in use in the Korean War, at least in 1950. Over 100 would spearhead the North Korean invasion of South Korea in June of that year. And at first, they did quite well. They went up against the U.S.'s light tank, the M24 Chaffee. And it only had a 75 millimeter gun. And yeah, the 85 millimeter T-34 enjoyed quite some good success. But it wouldn't last long. Soon, the M26 Pershing, the M46 Patent, and the good old M4 would be in theater, giving the T-34 a run for its money. And after losing over 200 tanks, really by October, November of 1950, large tank battles were already over in the Korean War, and things would go other ways. Also, aircraft really started to take a toll on World War II era tanks like this. Really didn't have any defense against them, and America and Britain had plenty of good jets and even piston aircraft that could do some tank plinking. So, less consequential by the time China had joined in, but there still would be some tank action in 1951, 52, 53. Another notable user, and there were so many after the war, would be Cuba. As soon as Fidel declared himself communist and allied with Russia, actually somewhat to Khrushchev's chagrin, as ironically as that sounds, several things were made gifted to them, including some T-34s, and it wouldn't be long before Cuba would put them into action in 1961 to repel the Bay of Pigs invasion. And from there, they would continue to field them when Cuba intervened in Angola in the 70s into the 80s. And they actually wouldn't really retire the T-34 until the mid-80s, when it was finally replaced by the T-54, T-62, and so on and so forth. And one more, just to mention it, because of the Vietnam War. Vietnam was, of course, another major user, and still has them technically in inventory today. They were used, actually, first against America, but then later in the Sino-Vietnamese War against China. So China actually fought against the T-34 later on. And Vietnam kept them in active service into the 80s, put them in storage, but still kept some T-34s around for training and what have you into the 21st century. And for all we know, some still might be used for training into 2021. And of course, again, there's tons of other users. For example, Egypt and Syria used them a lot in the Middle East, as did Iraq and Iran. And they pop up everywhere. At still 40,000 surviving World War II, it's no wonder. And it was still a relatively effective fighting machine, at least until the true modern age. But again, you could do a whole video just on the T-34's post-war history. And even after such a long video, we're not even scratching the surface of this vehicle. It wasn't a wonder weapon. It didn't introduce anything. The Christie suspension system had pros and cons, but frankly was just a holdover from the BT series, which was originally created to replace. Notice that pretty much all the later Russian tanks, including the prototype T-43, went to the torsion bar system. So really it was just that. And the sloped armor, well, it didn't start with the T-34, and really the tank took it to an unnecessary extreme, having it out on all sides. It did sacrifice room inside, especially on the early versions. But on the other hand, it did make it lighter and kind of effective for defensive war. It was always pretty well gunned. The 76 and 85 millimeter guns were never the most powerful or effective, but they were always good enough. And so were most of the other components. Of course, like I said, especially tanks made in late 41, 42, and early 43 had some pretty gnarly welding. They weren't exactly the prettiest machines. From the welding to the riveting, whatever existed, to the rough casting, to the lack of creature comforts, it was one of the most uncomfortable tanks to be in the world. Barely having seats sometimes. Although, yeah, by 1944-45, they at least had a few basic amenities. At least they didn't cram two people into a, 4-foot wide crevice and then give the commander a ton of jobs. They actually gave him a decent little hatch to view from. And radios became a standard feature, so there's that. And other things, like I said, smoke generators, auxiliary fuel tanks, kind of extended its usefulness and range. But again, it never really had aircraft defense to speak of, although, to be fair, about the best a tank can hope for is defense against a helicopter. And this was kind of made at a time before those really existed, at least in a combat version. But, all that said, it is a very impressive machine for what it was, and it was the perfect tank for Russia's situation. And whereas they improved it throughout the war, it's almost as if Germany slid backwards. They should have been able to create something on numbers like this to fight the Russians, but instead they made bigger and more costly tanks. Yeah, a Tiger, a Panther even. Very effective individual machine, but when you can only make one of them for every 10 or even 50 of your enemy's tanks, does it really matter? Plus, again, Germany picked a fight not just with the T-34, but also the Sherman. Don't do that. Russia and the U.S. were able to just simply outproduce. And while a tank isn't going to win or lose a war, it was real damn critical in 1941 and 1942. Could be a very different world without it. But anyway, I might do a follow-up video with more stuff later, more anecdotes, because there's a lot of kind of funny, very Russian-esque things to say about these. But since I've been doing this armor series, I knew I had to do something pretty soon on this tank. You gotta love these long cannons on these. Yeah. They actually had to be pretty careful not to dip these into the snow or mud if they were going down with the cannon turned down. Typically they would just elevate the cannon up when traversing ground just to keep it from getting plugged by mud or snow or what have yous. This one really is neat with the rolling wheels. Of course it won't roll on the carpet, but other than that. So yeah, I'm tired, so I'm going to let you go. I appreciate you tuning in, and we'll kind of move on from this. Maybe we'll go back to modern tanks for a bit, since we've been in World War II for a few episodes. Let me know what you think. What you'd like to see next. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.